In the first days of January 1709, across much of Europe, the air grew suddenly sharp. Rivers turned to stone, wells froze solid, and even the sea itself formed crusts of ice along its edges. It was the beginning of what many would later call the Great Frost, the coldest winter in recorded European history. Villages fell silent under blankets of snow. Carts stalled in drifts that no horse could cross, and families huddled in their homes as frost crept across walls and windows. For weeks, then months, the continent endured a freeze so deep that it reshaped not only landscapes, but lives, economies, and memories. Tonight, in Boring History for Sleep, we will move gently through that winter. We will explore what people saw, how they survived, and what traces the Great Frost left in the history of Europe. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe, so you can return again for more calm journeys into the hidden corners of the past. In the opening days of 1709, Europe awoke to a silence so deep that it seemed almost unnatural. Frost had crept silently through the night, laying its grip across fields, rivers, and villages alike. The chill was not merely sharp, it was absolute, as if the very breath of winter had hardened into iron. This was no ordinary season, no passing cold spell to be endured and forgotten. It was the beginning of what would later be remembered as the Great Frost, the harshest winter in living memory, and one of the coldest ever recorded on the continent. Reports from across Europe tell of a sudden and violent plunge in temperature, a change so swift that it shocked entire populations. In Paris, observers recorded on January 6th that the River Seine froze solid overnight, trapping boats in place and cutting off trade routes. In London, the Thames, already known for freezing in harsh winters, was locked in ice so thick that markets were set upon it. Farther east, in the plains of Poland and Hungary, the cold fell with such severity that cattle froze in their stalls, and wolves prowled closer to villages. Driven by hunger, what made the Great Frost so terrifying was not only its intensity, but its persistence. In earlier winters, a cold snap might last a week or two before breaking. But in January of 1709, the frost did not retreat. It lingered day after day, night after night, as if the season had settled into permanence. Wells froze so completely that families had to smash the ice daily to reach water. Mills stood silent, their wheels locked. Trees cracked and split as sap froze within their trunks, the sound echoing like rifle fire through the forests. For ordinary families, the first days were filled with disbelief. Surely, they thought, the frost would lift soon. Farmers brought animals indoors, crowding them into barns alongside families, hoping body heat would stave off death. Housewives layered blankets against windows and stuffed rags beneath doors, struggling to keep cold air at bay. In towns, bakers fought to keep ovens burning, but would supplies dwindled quickly as demand surged. In villages, people began to pull apart fences, carts, even furniture to feed their fires. The cold was so complete that even the strongest structures groaned under its pressure. Stone walls grew white with frost, iron hinges froze shut, and doors stuck fast in their frames. People found that their very breath condensed into ice crystals, falling like dust around their faces. Eyelashes froze together. Water spilled from a pail hardened before it reached the ground. Letters and diaries from the time describe frost creeping across the inside of homes, forming lace-like patterns on walls and ceilings. The arrival of the Great Frost was marked by countless small tragedies. Birds fell from the sky, frozen mid-flight. Fish died in rivers, trapped beneath the ice. Hunters who set out in the morning returned with nothing but frost-bitten fingers, for the game had either fled or starved. Farmers who still had food stores found them ruined as frost penetrated barns, turning apples to rock, wine to slush, and grain to brittle dust. The poor were hit first and hardest. Families without reserves had little to fall back upon. In cities, beggars huddled in church porches, their bodies stiff with cold by dawn. In rural villages, children were sent out to scavenge firewood, only to return empty-handed or not at all. Neighbors helped when they could, but in such severity, every household clung desperately to its own stores. The frost exposed the fragile balance of survival on which early modern Europe rested. The winter did not arrive in isolation. Europe in 1709 was already weary from years of conflict. The War of the Spanish Succession raged across the continent, draining treasuries, disrupting trade, and filling roads with soldiers. Armies camped in the open suffered catastrophic losses in the frost, with entire regiments frozen in their tents. Peasants who might have endured one bad harvest found themselves stretched beyond endurance by both war and weather. Thus, the frost fell not on a stable world, but on one already burdened with hardship. Nature itself seemed altered by the freeze. In parts of Italy, the Mediterranean coast saw ice form along harbors, an unheard-of event in living memory. In France, olive groves withered, their trees blackened by frost. Vineyards across Germany and Austria perished, the cold destroying roots that had stood for generations. The land itself bore witness to the severity of the season, reshaped by a cold so deep that it carved itself into memory. The first weeks of January 1709 established the pattern that would endure for months. Every morning, families awoke to a world muffled in silence, the air so sharp that even the act of drawing breath was painful. Smoke from chimneys hung low, heavy in the still air. Streets were empty except for those forced to fetch water or fuel. The frost, like an invisible tyrant, dictated every movement, every choice. And yet, amid the hardship, there was also resilience. Diaries record neighbors gathering to share what little warmth and food they had, families singing together to keep spirits alive, townspeople finding ways to turn frozen rivers into markets or places of meeting. The frost was merciless, but it also drew people into new patterns of endurance. Each act of survival, no matter how small, became a quiet defiance against the overwhelming cold. Thus, the arrival of the Great Frost was not merely the descent of winter, but the beginning of a trial that tested the fabric of European life. From the frozen Seine to the cracked forests of Poland, from the silent mills of Germany to the ice-edged harbors of Italy, an entire continent shivered under the same breath of cold. The winter had arrived with a force beyond memory, and its story was only just beginning. To imagine daily life during the Great Frost of 1709 is to picture a world where every ordinary action became a struggle. The rhythms of work, meals, and rest, all the familiar patterns of existence, were reshaped by the unrelenting cold. In towns and villages alike, survival became the only measure of daily life. Families who once measured time by the ringing of bells or the tolling of markets now measured it by how long the firewood lasted, how far their food stores could stretch, and how well their walls could hold back the bitter air. The home, usually a place of comfort, became a battleground. Fireplaces, once the heart of the household, burned constantly, yet never seemed enough. People huddled close together, sleeping in shared beds for warmth. Blankets, furs, and even spare clothing were piled onto sleeping places, yet still frost gathered on pillows by morning. Water left overnight in buckets froze solid, requiring axes or hammers to break it open. The simple act of cooking became arduous. Bread hardened quickly, soups froze in their pots, and even when food could be warmed, the heat dissipated almost immediately in the frigid air, which became more valuable than gold. In cities, prices soared as demand outstripped supply. Carpenters stripped their own workshops for fuel. Townsfolk pulled down sheds, fences, and even parts of their homes to feed their stoves. In villages, hedgerows were cut to the roots, and trees fell one after another, leaving the landscape bare. Some households resorted to burning straw, dung, or anything that would smolder, though the smoke often filled their homes with choking fumes. The shortage of fuel was as cruel as the shortage of food, and every household faced the constant question: heat or hunger? Markets reflected the desperation of the season. Fishmongers had nothing to sell, for rivers and lakes were frozen solid. Farmers who had stored grain found it spoiled or stolen, while animals died in their stalls, leaving butchers with little to offer. Prices rose daily, and the poor were driven to begging or worse. In Paris, eyewitnesses described people breaking apart frozen horse carcasses in the streets, hacking at them with axes to salvage meat. In London, the frozen Thames became a marketplace, but even there, much of what was sold was scraps and remnants, the better produce already hoarded by the wealthy. Work itself was transformed. Mills, whose wheels depended on flowing water, stood silent. Blacksmiths struggled to keep forges hot enough for their craft. Bakers could not always produce bread, and when they did, it was rationed strictly. Farmers, unable to plow the frozen ground or tend to dead livestock, spent their days scavenging wood or patching shelters. Sailors remained stranded, their ships locked in harbors by ice. Even simple trades like washing clothes or fetching water became ordeals. Linens froze stiff on lines, and wells were blocked with solid ice. The human toll was most visible among the poor. Beggars and laborers who relied on daily wages found themselves without work or income. Crowds gathered at churches and monasteries, hoping for charity in the form of bread or soup. Yet even the institutions of charity were strained. Grain stores dwindled, alms could not meet the demand, and soup kitchens ran out daily. Families in the countryside fared no better. Many lacked reserves and watched their children grow thin and weak as days stretched into weeks of hunger. Illness followed swiftly. The cold itself weakened bodies, making them susceptible to fevers, coughs, and infections. Crowded homes, with families huddled together around small fires, became breeding grounds for disease. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes, leaving lasting scars even for those who survived. The elderly and the very young were the first to perish, their bodies unable to endure the unrelenting chill. Diaries of the time speak of whole households extinguished in a matter of weeks, their cottages left silent beneath snow. And yet, despite the misery, life did not stop entirely. People adapted in small ways, crafting routines that carried them through the days. Women mended clothing with extra layers, sewing scraps of fabric into patchwork garments. Men fashioned makeshift boots from straw stuffed into worn shoes. Children were set to tasks of gathering twigs, tending fires, or watching over animals that had survived. In towns, neighbors sometimes gathered in single homes to share warmth, pooling resources to keep one fire burning rather than many. These acts of cooperation, though modest, became vital lifelines. Communal spaces also took on new roles. Churches, though cold themselves, provided shelter for those with nowhere else to go. Taverns remained open, offering warmth to those who could pay, though they too ran short of fuel and food. Market squares turned into gathering points, not just for trade, but for the exchange of news and mutual support. On frozen rivers like the Thames, makeshift stalls and tents became both necessity and entertainment, creating a strange mixture of hardship and festivity in the midst of crisis. The experience of daily life was also shaped by sound and silence. Streets that once echoed with vendors' cries and clattering carts now lay muffled under snow. The sharp crack of splitting trees or the sudden crash of ice became startling intrusions into the stillness. Indoors, the sounds were of coughing, the constant tending of fires, and the hiss of steam when frozen pots were thawed. People wrote of a silence that felt heavy, broken only by the groans of houses under frost. Despite all this hardship, there was resilience in memory. Diaries record moments of shared laughter, songs sung to keep spirits alive, or the strange beauty of frost patterns glittering on windows. Children, even in hunger, sometimes found delight in skating on frozen ponds or sledding down snowdrifts. Adults, though weary, took pride in small victories: a fire that lasted through the night, a pot of soup stretched farther than expected, a neighbor helped in time of need. These fragments of humanity softened the harshness of the season, proving that even in the coldest winter, warmth could be found in the bonds between people, daily life under the frost. Then was not only a story of misery, but of endurance. It was the struggle to maintain ordinary rhythms, meals, work, worship, companionship, in the face of extraordinary hardship. Each day brought challenges, but also acts of quiet determination. In the end, it was not only the cold that defined the winter, but the resilience of those who endured it. Thus, the Great Frost of 1709 lives on in memory not simply as a climate event, but as a human story. The story of how millions across Europe adapted, suffered, and survived. In every frozen loaf, every shattered well, every shared blanket, we see the traces of daily life reshaped by one of history's coldest winters. To walk across Europe during the winter of 1709 was to step into a continent transformed beyond recognition. The familiar hills, rivers, forests, and fields that had shaped generations of lives were altered so completely by frost and snow that they seemed like the surface of another world. The Great Frost was not merely felt in homes and villages, it reshaped the very face of the land. It silenced waters, stripped forests, and pressed down upon the soil until it groaned beneath the weight of ice. The rivers tell perhaps the clearest story. Across the continent, waterways that had flowed for centuries became motionless, locked beneath layers of ice so thick that carts and crowds could move across them. In Paris, the Seine, long the artery of trade and travel, was choked and still. Fishermen abandoned their nets, for beneath the ice no catch could be made. In London, the Thames froze from bank to bank, creating what came to be called a frost fair. Stalls, tents, and even small fires were set up upon its surface, as though the river had become another street of the city. Farther east, rivers like the Vistula, the Danube, and the Elbe stood silent, their waters sealed away as if the earth itself had stopped breathing. Lakes and ponds followed the same fate. Where children had once splashed in summer and fishermen cast their nets in autumn, now lay expanses of glittering white, silent and solid. The ice stretched so far that it seemed endless, reflecting the pale light of a weak sun. Travel across these surfaces was possible but dangerous, for cracks sometimes appeared without warning, echoing like cannon fire across the still air. Diaries speak of whole groups venturing across lakes only to scatter in terror when the ice groaned beneath them. The forests, too, bore scars of the frost. Trees that had stood for centuries split open with sharp reports as sap inside froze and expanded. Branches fell under the weight of snow, leaving splintered stumps and shattered crowns. Entire groves of olive trees in southern France blackened and died, their roots destroyed by frost reaching deep into the soil. Vineyards withered across Italy and Germany, their twisted vines brittle as glass. Even hardy oaks and pines groaned in the cold, their bark cracking as though the land itself were in pain. Fields lay barren beneath drifts of snow. The soil, frozen to the depth of a man's arm, could not be plowed, and seeds already sown were lost. In some places, snow piled so high that fences and hedges vanished, leaving only the faint outlines of buildings to mark human presence. Farmers stared out across blank expanses where once neat rows of crops had stretched. The land that had fed them for generations had been smothered, locked away under a frozen shroud. Animals left their traces upon this changed landscape. Deer were found frozen in fields, their bodies stiff and still, caught by the sudden descent of cold. Wolves crept closer to villages, their paw prints marked in snow where they had prowled in search of food. Birds fell from the sky, their wings too heavy with ice to carry them farther. Rivers that had once provided fish now offered only silence, and hunters returned empty-handed from forests stripped of life. The frost not only reshaped the land, but drove creatures to desperation, blurring the boundaries between wild and human space. The coastlines bore witness as well. In the Netherlands, canals froze so firmly that they became highways for sledges and skaters. In Italy, reports tell of sea water freezing in harbors, trapping ships in strange prisons of ice. Fishermen's boats sat idle, their nets useless, while gulls wheeled overhead in search of scraps. The sight of salt water turned solid astonished those who lived by the sea, a reminder that this frost was beyond ordinary memory. Towns and cities themselves became part of the frozen landscape. Streets lay thick with snow that never melted, packed hard by countless feet and cartwheels. Icicles hung from roofs like daggers, glittering in weak daylight. Wells, fountains, and cisterns froze solid, their surfaces glistening like glass. In some places, water pipes burst under the strain of ice, flooding streets before freezing again into jagged sheets. Buildings themselves seemed to shiver, stone walls exhaling white frost, wooden beams cracking in the silence. The sounds of this frozen landscape were strange and haunting. In forests, the splitting of trees rang out like musket fire, startling travelers in the quiet. On rivers, the groans and cracks of ice echoed like drums. The wind carried its own music, thin, sharp whistles through broken shutters, or mournful sighs across empty fields. Even the air seemed changed, each breath taken with difficulty, each word spoken turning instantly to frost. It was a world not only seen but heard differently, filled with noises of breaking, cracking, and silence. The visual transformation was equally stark. Landscapes once colored with greens and browns were replaced by endless shades of white, gray, and pale blue. The sun, when it appeared, seemed faint and distant, casting weak light across the snow. Nights glowed strangely, for the frozen ground reflected moonlight until whole fields shimmered as though made of glass. To walk through such scenes was to feel both awe and dread, beauty carved from hardship, splendor built upon suffering. Human memory captured these images with awe. Chroniclers wrote of churches rimmed with ice, of towns that seemed carved from frost, of mountains gleaming brighter than ever before. For those who lived through it, the frozen landscape of 1709 was unforgettable. It was not merely background but participant in their lives, shaping their choices, limiting their movements, and filling their eyes with visions of a world remade by cold. The frozen landscape also carried symbolism. To many, it felt like divine judgment, the earth itself rebelling against human pride. To others, it was a reminder of nature's power, a humbling force against which no king, council, or army could stand. Whether seen as punishment or lesson, the landscape was a teacher, showing the fragility of human life when confronted by elemental extremes. And yet, within this silence and severity, there were moments of strange wonder. Children, bundled against the cold, marveled at icicles glittering like jewels. Farmers paused in their despair to admire snowdrifts shaped like waves. Travelers wrote of horizons so white and endless they seemed like the edge of the world. Beauty existed even in hardship, though it came at a price. Thus, the frozen landscape of the Great Frost was more than a stage upon which human suffering unfolded. It was an active force, reshaping lives, altering economies, and engraving itself into memory. From frozen seas to shattered forests, from silent rivers to gleaming fields, the land itself became a witness to one of history's most extraordinary winters. By the time the frost of 1709 had settled deeply across Europe, the greatest fear was no longer the cold itself, but what followed in its wake. Hunger, Cold starved the fields, silenced the rivers, and withered the animals, but hunger starved the people. If the frost was the silent tyrant of that winter, hunger was its most relentless companion, gnawing at households night after night. Every class, from peasants in their cottages to noblemen in their halls, felt its grip, though some bore it more heavily than others. Food shortages began almost immediately. By January, stores that had been carefully laid aside in autumn were already dwindling. Farmers who had preserved grain found their barns compromised, frost creeping into sacks until kernels split and turned to powder. Apples, pears, and root vegetables froze solid, cracking their skins and rotting when thawed. Wine turned to slush, and barrels of ale burst from the expansion of ice. What should have carried families through the winter instead turned into ruined heaps. Markets reflected the crisis. Prices soared with terrifying speed. In France, the cost of bread doubled, then tripled within weeks, pushing the poor into desperation. In England, even those with money struggled to find supplies, for merchants hoarded what little remained. In Poland and Germany, whole towns found themselves without flour, relying instead on boiled weeds, ground acorns, or whatever scraps could be scavenged. The usual rhythms of trade broke down, replaced by a frantic scramble for survival. Meat, once a rare luxury for peasants, became almost impossible to find. Cattle perished in frozen stalls, their carcasses often too stiff to butcher. Sheep and goats, starved of forage buried beneath snow, collapsed in fields. Pigs, unable to root through the hard ground, wasted away. Even chickens froze upon their perches, leaving villages eerily silent without their morning calls. The loss of livestock was catastrophic not only for that season, but for years to come, for breeding herds and flocks were destroyed in days. Hunger reshaped daily life. Families cut their meals to the barest portions, a crust of bread shared between several, a thin soup made from boiled straw or bark. Mothers gave up their shares to feed children, while fathers went hungry to keep strength for labor. In towns, beggars swarmed around bakeries, desperate for crumbs. Children picked through refuse piles for peelings or bones. In villages, neighbors gathered to share what little remained, though each knew it meant less for their own families. The poor suffered most visibly, but even the wealthy were not immune. Nobles complained of empty cellars and ruined wine. Monasteries, long considered safe with their well-stocked granaries, opened their stores to feed the hungry, but found themselves overwhelmed by demand. Armies, already strained by the War of the Spanish Succession, struggled to feed their soldiers. In some camps, men deserted not from fear of battle, but from starvation. Hunger crossed boundaries of class and nation, reminding all of the fragility of human wealth when the earth itself refused to yield. Starvation left its mark not only on bodies, but on society. Riots broke out in towns where bakers were accused of hoarding or cheating with weights. Councils passed strict regulations, fixing bread prices and punishing those who profiteered, yet enforcement often failed. In France, records tell of desperate crowds storming granaries. In Italy, travelers reported villages where people ate boiled leather or the flesh of dead animals found on the roads. Hunger stripped away dignity, leaving only the raw instinct to survive. Illness followed swiftly on the heels of hunger. Malnourished bodies weakened, making people more vulnerable to disease. Fevers spread through crowded homes, and infections lingered where once they might have passed quickly. Frostbite, already a danger, became fatal when combined with starvation. The elderly and infants died in greatest numbers, their names filling parish registers. Graveyards swelled, their fresh mounds covered in snow, a stark reminder of hunger's toll. Yet in the midst of hardship, resilience emerged. Communities organized soup kitchens, churches gathered donations, and wealthier citizens sometimes distributed bread. Farmers experimented with alternatives, grinding chestnuts or acorns into flour, boiling nettles for stews. These measures seldom satisfied hunger fully, but they stretched survival. Diaries speak of pride in making do, of mothers who managed to keep children alive through ingenuity, of neighbors who pooled resources to see one another through. Hunger revealed not only desperation but also solidarity. The psychological toll, however, was immense. Hunger gnawed not only at the stomach but at the spirit. People wrote of constant dreams of food, of feasts imagined in the night. Children cried through evenings, their thin voices echoing in cottages. Adults grew irritable, tempers fraying under strain. Trust frayed too. Suspicions grew that bakers mixed sawdust into bread, that merchants hid secret stores, that neighbors kept food back in selfishness. The frost tested not only bodies but communities, straining the fragile bonds that held them together. Across Europe, hunger of the Great Frost of 1709 left permanent scars. Entire harvests were lost, herds decimated, and orchards destroyed. Recovery would take years, even decades, in some regions. Families that had once lived securely slipped into poverty. Villages emptied as survivors fled to cities in search of relief. Population declines marked the worst-hit areas, their empty cottages a reminder of the season when hunger ruled. And yet, this hardship entered memory as both warning and testament. Chroniclers described it with horror, but also with awe at the endurance of those who lived through it. The Great Frost became not only a climate event, but a story of hunger and survival, carried in family tales, parish records, and state reports. Its memory lingered as a lesson of fragility, a reminder of the thin line between plenty and famine, between life and death. Thus, hardship and hunger defined the winter of 1709 more deeply than even the frost itself. The cold carved the land, but hunger carved the people. It reshaped bodies, families, and communities, leaving scars that outlasted the season. And those centuries have passed, the echoes of that hunger remain in history, a silent testament to the power of nature and the resilience of those who endured its most merciless trial. When the frost of 1709 spread its icy hand across Europe, it brought not only physical hardship, but also a flood of questions. Why had the cold descended with such force? What power could bring rivers to stillness, split trees in their trunks, and starve whole populations? In an age before modern meteorology, explanations arose from faith, fear, and tradition. People searched their scriptures, their superstitions, and their memories for meaning. The Great Frost was not seen merely as a natural event. It was a sign, a lesson, and, for many, a warning. Faith offered the first framework for understanding. In churches from Lisbon to Warsaw, sermons thundered with interpretations. Some preachers declared that the frost was divine punishment, a chastisement for human pride, greed, or sin. The silence of frozen fields and the death of animals were painted as judgments from heaven, warnings that society must repent. Congregations shivered not only from the cold, but from the weight of guilt, convinced that their suffering held spiritual meaning. Other voices within the church offered gentler explanations. They spoke of the frost as a trial, a test of endurance sent to strengthen faith. Just as Job had endured suffering, so too must Europe endure its winter. In this reading, the frost was not wrath but refinement, a bitter medicine meant to purify and draw people closer to divine mercy. In either case, punishment or test, the language of faith gave shape to chaos, placing the inexplicable cold within a larger story of human life and destiny. Fear also found its expression in superstition. Among rural communities, where tradition ran deep, old beliefs resurfaced. Some whispered that witches had cursed the land, bringing frost as vengeance. Others blamed malevolent spirits of air and water, angered by human disturbance of forests and rivers. In parts of Germany, tales spread of frost giants roaming the countryside, their breath freezing fields in an instant. In France, Peasants muttered that strange lights seen in the skies were omens, sparks of heavenly fire that foretold disaster. Such fears, though unscientific, provided comfort in their familiarity. People had always explained hardship by unseen forces, and the frost was folded naturally into that pattern. The elite sought explanations in memory and history. Scholars recalled earlier harsh winters, searching chronicles for precedents. They pointed to the Little Ice Age, a period of colder climate that had marked recent centuries, though the phrase itself was not yet known. Pamphlets circulated with speculations. Some blamed shifting winds, others the positions of the stars, still others the sins of rulers or the corruption of courts. These writings mixed observation with moral commentary, reflecting a society where natural events and human behavior were still thought deeply intertwined. Even political explanations arose. In France, critics whispered that the frost was a sign of heaven's disapproval of Louis XIV's endless wars. In the Holy Roman Empire, pamphlets suggested it was divine judgment on rulers who had strayed from virtue. The frost thus became a canvas onto which fears, hopes, and resentments were projected. Every faction found in it evidence of its own convictions, turning cold weather into a stage for human argument. Amid these interpretations, practical voices also emerged. Farmers and villagers, though without modern science, observed carefully. They noted the stillness of winds, the clear skies, the strange dryness that accompanied the frost. Some concluded that the sun itself was weakened, its light pale and insufficient. Others thought the earth was shifting, tilting away from warmth. These explanations, though speculative, were rooted in close attention to nature. They reveal a world where people tried earnestly to connect daily observation with greater meaning. Fear also bred rituals of protection. Families lit candles in windows, prayed more fervently at altars, and carried charms against the cold. In some regions, processions were held, communities marching together in hopes of lifting the frost. Bells rang across frozen valleys, their sound meant to chase away the chill. Whether or not these rituals brought comfort, they bound people together, giving them a sense of agency against forces they could not control. The intellectual world, too, sought answers. Natural philosophers, what we would call scientists, began to measure temperatures with newly refined instruments. Thermometers, still a recent invention, recorded lows never before seen. Diaries noted precise dates, capturing the progression of the frost day by day. In doing so, they laid groundwork for future understanding, even if they could not yet explain the underlying causes. The very effort to measure revealed a growing curiosity, a desire to move beyond superstition toward observation. For many ordinary people, however, fear outweighed curiosity. Hunger and death magnified every omen. A halo around the moon became a prophecy of deeper cold. A sudden gust of wind was read as the approach of judgment. Memory of past winters blurred with the present, creating an atmosphere of dread. In this way, fear was as much a part of daily life as frost itself, a shadow that clung to minds as tightly as ice clung to trees. Yet, even within fear, there was resilience. Communities leaned on their faith, whether through sermons, rituals, or personal prayer. Explanations, even if mistaken, provided a kind of strength. To believe the frost was a test was to believe one could endure. To believe it was punishment was to believe repentance might bring relief. In both cases, faith transformed despair into meaning, and meaning into endurance. Thus, the Great Frost of 1709 was not only a meteorological crisis, but a spiritual and cultural one. It exposed the limits of human knowledge, pressing people to turn to tradition, faith, and fear for answers. In their churches, their folk tales, and their daily rituals, they wove the inexplicable into the fabric of life. What we see, looking back, is not only the suffering of hunger and cold, but the extraordinary human effort to explain, to endure, and to find hope amid the harshest winter Europe had ever known. The Great Frost of 1709 did more than freeze rivers and starve families. It tore at the very foundations of Europe's economy. For in an age when agriculture was the lifeblood of society, when nearly every household depended directly or indirectly on the yield of fields and herds, the devastation of the frost was not confined to barns and cottages. It reached markets, treasuries, and kingdoms. To understand the scale of the frost is to see how a season of cold could ripple outward into years of scarcity, reshaping economies and altering the lives of millions. Agriculture bore the first and deepest wounds. Fields that had been plowed and sown in autumn were lost entirely. The frost penetrated deep into the soil, killing seeds before they could sprout. Winter crops, such as rye and wheat, usually hardy enough to endure ordinary cold, withered in the ground. Farmers who walked their lands in spring found bare earth where green shoots should have been. In France, reports tell of entire provinces where not a stalk of wheat survived. In Germany and Poland, rye fields lay blackened, their roots destroyed. Across Italy, vineyards that had supplied wine for generations were ruined, vines brittle and lifeless. Orchards suffered equally. Apple, pear, and plum trees split under the cold, their bark cracking as frost invaded their sap. In southern France and northern Italy, olive groves, so long a symbol of endurance, withered by the thousands. The damage was not just seasonal, but generational, for trees that took decades to grow were lost in weeks. Farmers mourned not only the harvest of 1709, but the loss of future harvests, their livelihoods cut short for years to come. Livestock fared no better. Cattle froze in their stalls, their breath turned to ice before their muzzles. Sheep, deprived of pasture beneath snow, collapsed in droves. Horses, essential for plowing and transport, grew weak and died in alarming numbers. Pigs starved for lack of forage, while poultry froze on their roosts. The death of animals meant more than empty tables. It meant no traction for plows, no manure for fields, no wool for clothing, no hides for leather. Entire rural economies, built on the interdependence of crops and animals, unraveled. The economic consequences soon became visible in markets. Grain, already scarce, soared in price. In France, the cost of bread, the staple food of the majority, doubled and then tripled. Bakers rationed what little flour they had, while riots broke out in towns where hungry crowds accused merchants of hoarding. In England, records show that the price of wheat rose to levels not seen in living memory. Across Central and Eastern Europe, barter returned in place of coin, as people exchanged scraps of food for tools, clothing, or labor. Trade routes faltered. Frozen rivers halted the movement of goods, while snow-blocked roads cut towns off from one another. Markets that once bustled with exchange stood half empty. Fishermen, unable to ply their trade, contributed nothing to urban diets. Merchants who had invested in goods saw them rot in storage. Ships lay idle in frozen harbors, their crews unpaid and restless. The entire machinery of commerce slowed, creaking under the pressure of a frozen world. The frost struck at industries beyond farming. In France, the wine trade collapsed as vineyards perished. In Italy, the olive oil trade suffered devastating losses. In Northern Europe, cloth production faltered, not only because of lost wool from sheep, but also because dye works and mills required flowing water, now stilled by ice. Even charcoal production declined, for forests lay shattered and frozen. They were difficult to harvest or transport. Each industry's decline deepened the hardship, feeding into a cycle of scarcity and unemployment. Governments felt the strain. Tax revenues, already weakened by war, dwindled further as peasants had nothing to give. Monarchs faced the dilemma of feeding their people while funding armies. In France, Louis XIV's already exhausted treasury buckled further under the burden of famine relief. In smaller states, councils struggled to import grain, competing fiercely with neighbors for limited supplies. The frost thus intensified political pressures, sharpening conflicts already brewing across the continent. The War of the Spanish Succession, raging at the time, magnified these effects. Armies needed food, horses, and supplies, yet the frost stripped them of all three. Soldiers froze in camps, supply lines collapsed, and campaigns faltered. Civilians already burdened by billeting troops now found themselves sharing scarce bread with soldiers. The economic weight of the frost was therefore not only domestic but military, reshaping the course of the war itself. The effects were not fleeting. Even when the frost lifted, the damage lingered. Farmers lacked seed for spring planting, their reserves eaten during the crisis. Surviving livestock were too few to work the fields effectively. Orchards and vineyards would take decades to recover, if they ever did. Thus, the agricultural shortfall of 1709 cast a shadow over 1710 and beyond, ensuring that hunger persisted long after the ice melted. In some regions, the frost accelerated migration. Families abandoned ruined farms and sought work in cities, swelling urban populations already strained by scarcity. Others moved across borders, searching for lands less affected. These shifts unsettled economies further, altering patterns of labor and landholding. Landlords, unable to collect rents from starving tenants, consolidated holdings, changing the social fabric of rural Europe. Yet amid devastation, adaptation also occurred. Farmers experimented with new crops less vulnerable to frost, while governments invested in grain storage and improved transport. The memory of 1709 spurred reforms that slowly reshaped European agriculture, embedding in policy the lesson that nature could devastate economies as surely as war. The Great Frost thus left a double legacy. In the short term, it brought hunger, bankruptcy, and collapse. In the long term, it revealed the vulnerabilities of an economy rooted so deeply in fragile cycles of weather and harvest. It showed how a single season of cold could bring kingdoms to their knees, not only through famine, but through the unraveling of trade, industry, and finance. The impact of 1709 was not forgotten. In chronicles, pamphlets, and diaries, writers recorded not only the cold, but the ruin it brought to fields, markets, and treasuries. They saw clearly that the frost was more than a natural event. It was an economic catastrophe, a reminder of the thin line between stability and collapse. And in remembering, they left us a testimony of how deeply climate and economy were entwined in the fragile balance of early modern Europe. The Great Frost of 1709 pressed down upon Europe with such force that survival itself became an achievement. Across cities, towns, and villages, people searched for ways to endure the relentless cold and hunger. Their strategies, born from desperation but also ingenuity, reveal how communities adapted when ordinary life collapsed. These methods were not always successful, nor always equal, but together they tell the story of how millions struggled through the coldest winter in memory. The first strategy was fire. Nothing mattered more than heat. Families gathered every scrap of what they could find, pulling apart fences, sheds, and even furniture. In towns, broken carts and market stalls were dismantled for fuel. Churches stripped pews, monasteries sacrificed wooden beams, and in some places, whole orchards were felled to keep stoves burning. Where wood ran out, people turned to substitutes, burning straw, dung, or peat. The smoke was thick and foul, but it gave warmth, however slight. In cities, the air grew heavy with this mixture, as though the frost had driven smoke itself to settle low over rooftops. Clothing became another line of defense. Families layered garments, wearing shirts and cloaks day and night. Rags were wrapped around hands and feet, straw stuffed into shoes, and animal skins stitched crudely into coats. Wealthier households commissioned heavier cloaks lined with fur, but even they suffered. for no fabric seemed enough. Diaries speak of people sleeping in all their clothes at once, yet still waking to find frost gathered on their blankets. The art of survival was not elegance, but endurance. Food required constant ingenuity. When grain ran out, families sought substitutes. Bread was stretched with ground acorns, chestnuts, or even sawdust, though such mixtures caused illness. Soups were made from nettles, bark, or boiled straw. In the countryside, families dug into frozen earth to unearth roots, risking frostbite for scraps. In towns, scavenging became common. Horse carcasses on frozen streets were hacked apart for meat, and refuse heaps combed for anything edible. Those with livestock guarded them fiercely, for a surviving cow or goat meant milk, however thin, and a chance at survival beyond the frost. Communities also turned to sharing. Neighbors sometimes gathered in a single house to pool heat and food, abandoning other dwellings until spring. Extended families crowded together, spreading resources as best they could. Churches and monasteries organized soup kitchens, though demand always exceeded supply. In some regions, local councils imposed rationing, distributing bread or grain at fixed prices. These measures did not eliminate hunger, but they slowed its worst effects. Ingenuity extended to water as well. Wells froze solid, leaving families without their usual supply. People learned to break river ice for water, or to melt snow and frost gathered from rooftops. The process was laborious, yet without it thirst joined hunger as a danger. Diaries mention families carefully collecting icicles from eaves, melting them in pots for drinking water. Even in hardship, people adapted to use the very frost against itself. Work and labor were reshaped too. Farmers, unable to plow, spent days cutting wood or repairing buildings. Children were tasked with scavenging twigs, tending fires, or caring for what animals survived. Women stretched meals, mended clothing, and organized households for survival. Men sought day labor where possible, though work was scarce. In towns, craftsmen shifted their trades to meet new needs. Blacksmiths forged stronger stoves. Weavers produced thicker fabrics. Carpenters turned to cutting firewood. The frost redirected the energy of society into pure endurance. Survival also depended on networks of aid. In wealthier households, landlords sometimes distributed grain to tenants, whether from duty or fear of revolt. In others, the poor stormed granaries, forcing relief. Armies struggling with supply lines plundered from nearby villages, while villages in turn hid their stores to protect them. The balance between cooperation and conflict shaped survival, as communities sometimes drew closer and sometimes fractured under strain. Faith played a role in survival strategies as well. People sought strength in prayer, processions, and rituals. Bells were rung to ward off frost, candles lit in windows as symbols of hope. Clergy encouraged endurance by framing suffering as a test or punishment with meaning. Whether or not such beliefs changed the weather, they gave people courage, binding them together with shared explanations. Survival was as much about the spirit as the body. Children, surprisingly, often showed the greatest resilience. Though many died in the frost, those who survived adapted quickly. They played on frozen rivers, skated on ponds, and slid down drifts, turning hardship into moments of joy. Their laughter gave comfort to weary parents, reminding communities that life endured even in extremity. The presence of play amid hunger revealed the remarkable human instinct to find hope in the bleakest hours. Migration was another strategy, though a desperate one. Families abandoned ruined farms and walked toward cities in search of relief. Others crossed borders, moving to regions less struck by frost. Roads filled with gaunt figures, carrying bundles, leading children by the hand. Not all found safety. Many collapsed on the way. Yet migration reflected the will to survive, the refusal to wait passively as hunger claimed them. The wealthy, of course, had different strategies. They purchased grain at inflated prices, imported luxuries where possible, and retreated into estates stocked with reserves. Yet even they were not untouched. Vineyards that had sustained noble incomes perished, orchards that marked their wealth blackened, and cellars that once overflowed stood half empty. Their survival was easier, but not guaranteed. The frost was a great leveler, sparing no class entirely. One of the most remarkable survival strategies came from adaptation after the frost itself. Communities, remembering 1709, began to invest in grain storage, stronger shelters, and new crops. Farmers experimented with hardier varieties of rye and potatoes, while rulers encouraged the building of granaries and improved transport. Though born from suffering, these measures planted seeds of resilience for the future. Survival strategies of one generation became the reforms of the next. Yet, even with all these efforts, not all survived. Parishes recorded sharp increases in deaths, graveyards filled, and whole villages dwindled. Survival strategies were often not enough. But those who lived through the Great Frost carried with them a memory of endurance, a testament to human resilience against the most merciless of trials. Thus, survival during the Great Frost was not one thing, but many. Fire kept alive with scraps of wood, bread stretched with bitter substitutes, neighbors sharing one another's burdens, families migrating in hope of safety. It was the sum of countless small acts, each insufficient alone but powerful together. In those acts, Europe endured. The Great Frost of 1709 was not merely a season of cold. It was a crisis that rippled outward into the political and social fabric of Europe. In an age when monarchs ruled through fragile balances of power and communities survived on precarious harvests, the sudden collapse of food and fuel supplies shook the foundations of both authority and society. To understand the full weight of the frost is to see how weather became politics, and how survival itself reshaped the bonds between rulers and ruled. Across Europe, governments found themselves confronted with challenges they were ill-prepared to face. In France, where Louis XIV already presided over a kingdom strained by the War of the Spanish Succession, the frost struck like a hammer. Grain harvests were destroyed, livestock perished, and prices soared. The king's ministers tried to control the crisis through price fixing and forced grain requisitions, but these measures often backfired. Bakers refused to sell, merchants hid their stores, and angry crowds stormed granaries. The frost turned bread, the simplest staple of daily life, into a political weapon. Every loaf became a measure of royal legitimacy. Every empty bakery a potential spark for revolt. That in cities such as Paris, riots broke out when bread was scarce. Authorities attempted to quell unrest with armed patrols, but repression could not feed the hungry. At the same time, officials feared that leniency might embolden the crowd. The frost thus placed governments in a bind. To act harshly was to risk rebellion, but to fail to act was to appear powerless. In this delicate balance, royal authority trembled, exposed by the inability to command the weather or its consequences. Smaller states fared no better. In German principalities, councils faced similar crises as villagers demanded relief. Some rulers imported grain from neighboring lands, but prices were high and supplies limited. Others attempted to enforce rationing, distributing bread through official channels. Yet everywhere, the frost revealed the limits of political power. Even the most conscientious prince could not conjure wheat from frozen fields, and subjects quickly judged rulers not by their intentions, but by the fullness of their granaries. The social consequences were equally profound. Hunger stripped away the ordinary structures of deference and obedience. In villages, long accustomed to respecting landlords and priests, desperation sometimes boiled into anger. Rumors spread that the wealthy were hoarding grain, or that merchants had conjured scarcity for profit. Crowds attacked grain convoys, intercepted carts, and plundered warehouses. The frost turned neighbor against neighbor, and class resentments sharpened beneath the pressure of hunger. Charity, though widespread, could not erase these tensions. Churches opened their doors, monasteries distributed soup, and wealthy patrons gave alms, yet the need was overwhelming. For every loaf of bread handed out, 10 more families waited in vain. Those left empty-handed often felt betrayed, fueling resentment against institutions once seen as moral anchors. Thus, the frost tested not only the generosity, but also the legitimacy of religious and social institutions. The frost also reshaped communities through migration. Families abandoned ruined farms, moving toward towns in search of relief. Roads filled with hungry wanderers, their presence alarming urban authorities. Cities, already strained, struggled to absorb this influx. Begging increased, crime rose, and councils debated harsh measures against newcomers. In this way, the frost blurred boundaries between rural and urban, unsettling patterns of settlement that had long defined European life. Armies were not immune to political and social consequences. The War of the Spanish Succession raged across Europe, yet soldiers often found themselves without rations. Frostbitten and starving, many deserted, swelling the numbers of displaced poor. Commanders struggled to maintain discipline, while rulers feared that starving troops might turn against their own populations. War and weather combined to undermine the very structures of authority that monarchs relied upon. International politics, too, felt the strain. Grain shortages made states more competitive, each vying to secure supplies from less affected regions. Trade treaties were disrupted as governments prioritized domestic survival. Diplomats scrambled to negotiate shipments, while merchants charged exorbitant prices. The frost thus influenced not only local villages, but also the broader currents of European diplomacy, adding another layer of pressure to already fragile alliances. The psychological impact on politics should not be overlooked. Monarchs and councils alike were haunted by the knowledge that their authority rested, in part, on their ability to protect their people. When the frost revealed their impotence against nature, confidence in rulers eroded. In France, this erosion deepened the crisis of legitimacy that would, decades later, contribute to revolutionary ferment. Though the revolution lay far in the future, the frost of 1709 planted seeds of doubt about royal competence. Seeds watered by hunger and despair. Socially, the frost exposed the fragility of Europe's hierarchies. The wealthy could insulate themselves somewhat, buying scarce grain at inflated prices. Yet even they suffered as vineyards perished and incomes collapsed. The poor, by contrast, bore the brunt of hunger, their suffering stark and visible. This disparity hardened resentments, as people asked why some dined while others starved. In this way, the frost sharpened awareness of inequality, embedding it deeper into social consciousness. Yet amid collapse, there were also glimpses of resilience. Communities sometimes drew closer, neighbors pooling resources, councils improvising relief, and families adapting together. These acts did not erase suffering, but they revealed a social fabric not wholly destroyed. In the long view, such resilience helped societies recover. Though the memory of hunger lingered as a warning, the Great Frost thus reshaped politics and society not by changing rulers directly, but by exposing the limits of their power and the fragility of their bonds with the governed. It was a reminder that authority, whether royal, religious, or communal, rested not only on armies and laws, but on the ability to ensure survival. When that ability faltered, cracks appeared in the very structure of society. Looking back, the frost stands as one of history's starkest reminders of how climate can become politics, and how hunger can become rebellion. It teaches us that beneath the crowns of kings and the decisions of councils lies the simple, enduring truth that societies are held together by bread, warmth, and trust. When these fail, even the mightiest powers tremble. The winter of 1709 did not pass quietly into the annals of weather. It lingered in memory, etched into chronicles, diaries, and family stories, as one of the most extraordinary natural disasters of early modern Europe. The cold eventually lifted, fields thawed, and rivers flowed again, but the experience of the Great Frost endured long afterward. It shaped the way people thought about nature, economy, politics, and community. Its legacy was not only the graves it filled or the crops it destroyed, but the cultural imprint it left across generations. The memory of the Great Frost was, first of all, personal. Survivors carried vivid recollections of hunger, silence, and cold. Diaries from France, Germany, and England describe mornings when frost glittered inside houses, nights when families huddled together listening to trees crack like gunfire. These accounts, written in the immediacy of suffering, preserve the human voice of the frost. They tell of frozen wells, ruined orchards, and desperate meals made from bark or straw. For those who endured it, the winter became a marker of time. People spoke of their lives in relation to the year of the Great Frost, as though it were an era unto itself. Communities, too, preserved memory collectively. Parish records swelled with names of the dead, their entries sometimes annotated with notes like mort de froid, death by cold. Churches remembered the frost in sermons for years afterward, retelling the story as both caution and lesson. In France, villages marked the event in oral tradition, recalling how neighbors shared or failed to share, how barns stood empty, how children died. These communal memories bound communities together in a shared past of hardship. Governments remembered as well. In France, the monarchy, already strained by war and famine, found its reputation deeply scarred. Louis XIV's reign, long associated with grandeur, was increasingly linked with suffering and scarcity. The frost of 1709 contributed to the erosion of royal prestige, remembered as evidence that the Sun King could not shield his people from the simplest necessity, bread. Later generations of political thinkers, looking back, connected such failures with the eventual collapse of royal authority in the 18th century. Economically, the legacy was lasting. Vineyards in France and Germany took decades to recover, some never regaining their former vitality. Olive groves in Italy and southern France were destroyed, altering agricultural patterns for generations. Farmers remembered the frost as a warning of vulnerability, and governments invested in grain storage and transportation partly in response. In this sense, the frost shaped policy. It demonstrated that nature could ruin economies as swiftly as war, and that preparation for scarcity was as important as preparation for battle. Culturally, the frost became part of Europe's imagination of disaster. Pamphlets and chronicles described it in dramatic terms, emphasizing its universality. It was not a local misfortune, but a continental one, shared across nations and languages. Writers used it as a metaphor for divine punishment, for human weakness, or for the power of nature. Later historians, looking back, saw it as the most striking episode of the Little Ice Age, the colder climate period that stretched across centuries. In this way, the Great Frost became more than a memory. It became a symbol of an era. Art and literature reflected this legacy. Paintings of frozen rivers and snowy towns, though sometimes romanticized, carried echoes of 1709. Poems spoke of stillness, silence, and suffering. Even children's rhymes in later decades recalled winters as cold as the frost of '9. In every cultural form, the event left traces, reminders that no one who had lived through it could forget. The frost also left a legacy of fear. For decades afterward, cold snaps rekindled memories of 1709. Farmers panicked at early frosts, fearing a repetition. Families hoarded grain in greater quantities, lest hunger return. Governments monitored prices with heightened sensitivity, aware that scarcity could lead quickly to unrest. The memory of 1709 haunted Europe like a shadow, shaping reactions to future crises. But alongside fear, there was resilience. The frost became part of a narrative of endurance. Families told stories of how ancestors had survived by ingenuity, neighbors had shared food, or children had laughed even amid hunger. These stories carried pride as well as sorrow, affirming the capacity to endure extremes. The frost was not remembered solely as tragedy, but as a testament to survival. The legacy stretched into science, too. The frost spurred interest in measurement and observation. Thermometers, still new in 1709, were used widely to record the extraordinary cold, and those records later became invaluable to historians of climate. Natural philosophers began to ask sharper questions about weather, seeking explanations beyond superstition. In this way, the frost accelerated curiosity, nudging Europe further towards systematic study of the natural world that in the longer view. The Great Frost of 1709 became a touchstone in the history of climate and society. It stands as one of the clearest examples of how natural events could reshape economies, challenge governments, and alter culture. Its legacy is found in policy reforms, in chronicles of disaster, in literature and art, and in the quiet pride of families who remembered survival. Thus, the Great Frost was not merely a season of cold, it was a turning point. It revealed the fragility of early modern Europe, the dependence of millions on fragile harvests, and the inability of even kings to command nature. But it also revealed the resilience of communities, the creativity of survival, and the enduring human effort to find meaning in suffering. Its memory endures because it was more than weather. It was history carved in ice. The winter of 1709, the Great Frost, remains one of the most extraordinary episodes in Europe's long history. It was not a single storm, nor a passing chill, but a season that reshaped landscapes, destroyed harvests, silenced rivers, and pressed itself into memory with a weight that endured for centuries. Families lost loved ones, communities endured hunger, and rulers faced challenges they could neither command nor prevent. And yet, even amid devastation, there was resilience. People adapted, burning whatever they could find for warmth, sharing bread when none seemed left, migrating in search of safety, or simply enduring day after day with a quiet determination. The frost showed the fragility of human life, but also its strength. It reminded Europe that survival depended not only on rulers or armies, but on the small acts of endurance carried out in cottages, markets, and frozen fields. The Great Frost left behind scars, both on the land and in memory. Vineyards took decades to recover, villages were emptied, and stories of hunger passed through generations. But it also left behind lessons that nature is a force beyond control, that societies must prepare for scarcity, and that even in the harshest conditions, communities find ways to endure. Tonight, as we close this calm journey into the past, remember the people of 1709 who looked out across frozen rivers, who listened to trees splitting in the cold, who dreamed of warmth as they huddled together in silence. Their story is part of ours, a reminder that history is not only battles and kings, but winters survived, hardships endured, and resilience quietly carried forward. Thank you for joining Boring History for Sleep. If you found this story calming and meaningful, don't forget to like this video and subscribe, so you can return again for more gentle journeys through the overlooked corners of history. Good night.